Today, we are unpacking various issues under the global public policy pillar. We are beaming our searchlight on the key issue of fragmentation vis-a-vis global consensus. Multilateral institutions are becoming grossly inefficient due to diverging interest on the part of member states. And this is generating second-order challenges, particularly in the context of defining middle powers. Talk about middle power diplomacy, or the so-called niche diplomacy, and how that is really gaining influence as a core strategy deployed in international relations by middle powers to navigate the contemporary and existential economic and geopolitical challenges facing them. In the past, niche diplomacy was often associated with small states, especially those without the economic size and capacity to exert significant influence on the global stage, since they are usually not strong enough, maybe militarily, to have their way. Not that we expect middle powers to become a deciding force, although they can exercise persuasive influence, including playing key roles as intermediaries, like we've often seen with Canada in the past and even now. But it appears across the board, this paradigm is now what we see in the mainstream. There's a lot to unpack today. And today's discussion is titled Great Niche Diplomacy and Geopolitical Fragmentation from a Canadian perspective, given the unique background of our guest. And to help us make sense of these issues, I have a global policy juggernaut in the house. He has been called one of the leading international policy thinkers and strategists of his generation, and has been a professor of public policy in leading universities and policy schools across North America, Asia, and Europe. Indeed, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Irvin Studin, president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions and editor-in-chief and publisher of the Global Brief magazine. Dr. Studin is chair of the Worldwide Commission to Educate All Kids post-pandemic, a past Rhodes Scholar. He worked for a number of years in the Privy Council office in Ottawa, as well as in the Australian Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Irvin, thanks for joining the Global Recast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we get started, do you want to add anything to the bio that I just read for the benefit of our audience?
Not at all. I think it overstates everything.
Thank you. Okay, so why don't we delve in right away? My first question today takes a cue from your book, Canada Must Think for Itself. And in that book, one of your propositions is that Canada's 4.15 game this century is informed by its 4 newly conceived borders. You're of the opinion that for Canada to survive and succeed, its core strategic objective must be to minimize the frictions at the borders while maximizing the strategic rents from the management of its many vectored relationships. That's profound. Can you shed some light on this thesis?
Thanks so much for, again, for having me for this delightful show and platform, and for reading my work so carefully. I'm trying to reframe the many decades-long mental map that we hold in Canada at the popular level and at the elite decision-making level, which is a very banal mental map. We imagine that Canada in the early 21st century, like in the late 20th century, really turns on Canada-US relations full stop. And whenever you bring up any other borders or relationships or pressures or pull, we quickly reduce to the American border, that we're so ensconced in that imaginary. But that is too limiting, and I'll explain therefore why your opening supposition that we're a middle power does not apply in the early 21st century. Indeed, I argue in the same book that we're not a middle power. That's just a word that we use in Ottawa and some academic circles to describe what is a superficial understanding of present realities, and that is that I argue in the book that we have a fork in the road. Either we become a deep vassal state, which is our current condition. We are a vassal state of the United States, or we become a major term-setting power in classical literature and thinking. We become a great power, but I call it a term-setting power in order that we don't overly moralize the terminology. How is that so? Well, we go to your 4-point, 15-point game that we discuss. If you imagine Canada as essentially as a rectangle rather than a flat line, the rectangle has four sides. The bottom side is the American border, the A. The western side, Fred, is the C, the China. The northern side is R, Russia, and E is Europe. And why are they relevant? Obviously, the United States is our long-standing neighbor, the first or second most important country in the world. China on our western border is the most important country of the 21st century, certainly coming out of the pandemic, has the largest GDP in the world in PPP terms, but is also closer to us geographically, if we understand our own situation, than it is to Australia through the north and the west of the country. The north of the country is Russia, which is a major country, but now close to us because of climate change. We become neighbors with Russia. It's not some distant country to the east of Europe. And of course, Europe, whence the modern colonization of Canada hails. So ACRE all put together, America, China, Russia, Europe, those are our essential existential borders. Every country and situation extraneous to that configuration, whether it's Israel, Palestine, Nigeria, Indonesia, or Sudan, is largely irrelevant to our circumstances unless it mediates through those existential pressures, which could kill us at any point. Now, the United States, we understand why it could kill us or make us. China, we began to understand during the Meng Wanzhou crisis, but we will feel increasingly through Trump 2.0. Russia through the Arctic game, and Europe existentially, because that's where most of the wars have come during the lifetime of Canada, certainly in the last century. So ACRE, and if you look at do the math on that, that's 15 permutations of pressure and pull on our borders. They could pull us apart through any combination, or crush us, or if we're clever, they could make us this century. And therefore, we have a choice in front of us. Either we deeply vassalize to the American side, which is our predilection right now. It's our deep instinct, and it could happen very fast under Trump 2.0. Or mastering our circumstances, we become a major power just through surviving these very complex pushes and pulls. So that's the 4-point game with 15 combinations. And I like to commend it to colleagues, Canadians, and decision makers as the essential mental map of Canada in the 21st century. It's much more interesting, but it's obviously much more dire in its existential import for the country.
Thank you. That's quite a lot to unpack. And I do agree that these are unique times that we live in, and all of the key border states that you mentioned, obviously there's a lot in the literature, and the scholarship around those. But for the purposes of what we wanted to accomplish today, I'd like to dig in deeper a little bit to the US side. I'd like to explore more on the US side for the obvious reasons. I mean, no doubt you must be following recent developments vis-a-vis Trump 2.0 and Canada-US relations, from tariffs to the 54th state gesture or joke, whichever is more appropriate. And in your book, I go back to your book, you are very critical of Canada's ratification of the USMCA, otherwise known as NAFTA, before the ratification. As you know, both countries enjoy the world's most comprehensive trading relationship, from border cooperation and integrated electricity networks to security and defense arrangements. The union is a match made in heaven, as they say. But the relationship is also characterized not only by a level of asymmetry that is so high, by every material indicators of power, but also by a high degree of interdependence. So given this reality and the very unique nature of the US, I say to you, what practical options does Canada have beyond its soft power?
It's a great question, and it is, of course, the question of the day. Betrays the problem that I try to identify in the 15-point, 4-point, or four-border game that I posit in the book. It is that we tend to reduce our imagination right away to the American question, which of course is hyper important. Perhaps it's the most important border of them all. But if we excessively reduce our imagination, then we have only one option, that is to become an increasingly deeply vassalized state. Not a medium power, not a secondary country, not even an independent country. We become a vassalized extension of the American project. And very well, that may redound to the benefit of Canada. We can have that discussion in the country. The problem, as I see it, is that the American leadership, certainly in Trump 2.0, may not be a friendly one. It may be, as I describe it in a number of interventions, a predatory presidency. And therefore, that vassalized condition could become very painful indeed, certainly if we're surrounded by these other existential pressures and the American leadership and the American state does not have our back, as it were, as we might imagine in past administrations. And therefore, we're in trouble indeed. In the same book that you mentioned, Canada Must Think for Itself, 10 Theses for Our Country's Survival and Success in the 21st Century is my 2022 book. I also mention I think I foreshadow explicitly the possibility of annexation of Canada or annexation pressures by the United States under a Trump 2.0 scenario. And that is coming to pass even before the presidency has been officialized. I'm not suggesting I have any prophetic qualities, but I'm reading the strategic tea leaves and looking around the world and looking at our circumstances and understanding the strategic imagination psychology of the new president. And indeed, when he says that he is interested in Canada as a 51st state, or is worried about Canadian performance in security terms, or as some of his advisors have just suggested, worried about the northern border, which again is the Russia-China intersection in my mental map, they mean business. They say this with great seriousness. It is our strategic naivete in Canada that we should interpret this as a joke. So when I criticize USMCA, I did that at a still a pre-pandemic stage in Canadian strategic constitutional life. Pre-pandemic, we were still a stable, largely happy country, regardless of one's partisan stripes. We were largely a stable, wealthy, happy country. Post-pandemic is a completely different Canada. We've collapsed across many systems. We've really collapsed. It's an underperforming, unstable country with very weakly legitimate institutions across the country, regardless of what we tell ourselves. So if we go back now to 2018, 2019, I came out almost solo in the Canadian commentariat and policy world, as it were, fiercely opposed to the USMCA. Why was that so? And by the way, again, that was pre-pandemic when life was good. Now, post-pandemic, some of that potential misery is exposed, and that's because of three factors. First of all, we signed a massive treaty under pressure. That is, a gun was put to our head, and we signed what because of the pressure. That is, we imagined that the president of the day was going to cancel NAFTA, or as he's now threatening again the same persona in American power, massive tariffs. And we signed in fear of tariffs and also to remove tariffs. Ring a bell? Deja vu. And then the second point is we signed with an unreliable partner. That is, a president who would not honor the treaty, who celebrated the signature, but then went to behave and continue to threaten as if the treaty did not exist. And again, the treaty is in power today, and the president is pretending it doesn't exist, and again is threatening all sorts of unilateral, capricious tariffs as if USMCA didn't exist. Again, deja vu, ring a bell. This is the same president who wants a new deal now with us after the last deal was signed with him under pressure. And the third point is that the content of what we signed was treacherous to the Canadian cause of the 21st century. That is, as an independent, proud power that is able to master its circumstances and its 4-point, 15-point game or 15 combination game, as we've discussed. The treaty essentially vassalized us at international law by spelling in black and white a prohibition on Canada advancing trade or larger strategic relations with any other non-market power. Obviously, read China, read Russia, read any country that the United States fancies as a strategic rival. But these are countries at our own borders. Or these are the countries that the United States declares on any given day. Read from an outside perspective, that gives Washington its effective veto on Canadian strategic decision-making or any prospect of Canada advancing its own interests on any given day as it sees fit. Which means, again, if you bring that to a present value calculation, that Canada has no strategic prospects or instruments at all. There's nothing to discuss. Canada is a vassal state of the United States until we determine to work otherwise. Moving forward in a Trump 2.0 scenario, we have this same scenario revisited on us, but in more catastrophic form. That is the same untrustworthy president, untrustworthy because not because I have any personal animus towards the president. They were partisan animus, not at all. It's just this unreliable partner who will turn left or right, but wants us again to negotiate a new deal, whatever content he proposes, still unknown, under similar catastrophic pressure, with the inevitable result that it will vassalize us further, or in my submission, make us completely unrecognizable as a strategic entity, a completely unrecognizable Canada at the end of it. And so we have really catastrophic circumstances, again, post-pandemic, when the country is greatly weakened across the systems. Hence my opposition to USMCA pre-pandemic.
Yeah, these are quite heavy and profound submissions. And of course, as a renowned scholar in this space, you have your thoughts on these issues in the public arena. You've written many books but I wanted to just pinpoint the importance of trust, in all of this, as Canada determines the intensity of its relationships, in the coming decades. As you know, trust is an important factor in diplomacy. And in your book, I go back to the book again, Canada must think for itself. You say in that book that instead of being promiscuous and instead of being opportunistic, can you think of an alternative arrangement where Canada prioritizes creative deal making, in order to deliver win-win superior outcomes? And to do that, obviously, the trust factor cannot be relegated. So vis-a-vis US-Canada, how do you then explain the intricate relationships, between trust on the one side and the predatory presidency, according to you, that may befall Canada, in the coming months? How do you reconcile this conundrum, as it were?
By promiscuity, I mean that Canada must pick lessons from around the world and incorporate them into our strategic thinking, our strategic practice.
Yeah, just to be clear,
And
you pinpoint two key issues there, promiscuity and opportunism, right? Those were two key.
yeah, I don't even remember the opportunism in the book, but we should be opportunistic. I mean, there are opportunities to devassalize ourselves, there are opportunities to learn, and there are opportunities for Canadian performance, and we should always be opportunistic. The promiscuity, strategic promiscuity, is that we need to go around the world without ideology, without dogma, without any moralism, and even steal ideas from the rest of the world about how to live better, how to improve our own performance. And that's the way clever countries have performed throughout history. If we're not strategically promiscuous, we imagine that everything is in the United States, that they are the only place from which we can learn. And therefore, we become not only vassalized, but extremely dull as a culture, because the United States is not at the forefront of every area of human performance, far from it. And if we're behind the United States and they're behind the rest of the world, that means we're even further behind. Our reference point is too narrow. The 4.15 combination game that I posit allows for some of this more eclectic thinking and eclectic relationships, and not again just for form or for fetish. It is for existential necessity. So when we talk about the United States relationship, we have to be deep in that. We have to be deeply ensconced in the American relationship, trustworthy, as you describe, professional, reliable, but we need the same relationships across all the borders. So I'm for a Team Canada approach to China as well, and all of East Asia. I'm for a Team Canada approach to Russia and the former Soviet space, and I'm for a Team Canada approach to Europe. That's much more resources, much more uncomfortable than just the American relationship, but strategically necessary if we're going to devassalize, if we so wish. The problem again is that if we privilege the vassal condition, our present condition, and we have a predatory presidency, as we have, then that vassal condition could become painful indeed, very painful. Whereas on a good day with a good presidency and a reasonably stable Canada, the vassal condition suits us fine. What's wrong? Life is pretty good. Why rock the boat? You have to invent public problems in Canada. No longer. We have real existential pressures. They could collapse the country within the first year or two of the American presidency, or make it completely unrecognizable. Or we could raise our thinking, raise our level of practice, and say we're going to devassalize, but then we're going to have to work much harder. We're going to be much more cunning and clever across all our existential borders and circumstances, across the second largest country in the world, and make a 21st century for this great country.
Got it. Got it. Thanks a lot for that clarification. I mean, and again, very, very instructive. Let me move on quickly to a thematic issue here, not so broad, but very thematic, and that's on climate change. You know, again, based on some of your submissions in the book, you caution that any attempt by Canada to reverse climate change will lead to material misery and domination by other countries, driven by opportunism. But I have a caveat here. the Canadian economy, like is highly energy intensive, with heavy, heavy reliance on natural resources, oil and gas, and what have you. Those things are needed to heat our homes and power industries, right? And since there are multiple pathways to achieve decarbonization, I mean, we have many alternative choices vis-a-vis technology and policy. I have a question here. Are you saying that climate action is not worth the effort in Canada?
Yes.
And why? Can you give a nuanced perspective on that?
I'll give a very logical one, which is there is a confusion between the political sloganeering about climate action and climate change and the practical action entailed by one of the outcomes we posit. Are we in Canada purporting to contributing to changing climatic outcomes in the world? Is that the national goal of the Canadian project? Is that in that case it's a nonsense. It's a total nonsense, which is to say there's almost nothing we can do in the human condition to reverse climate circumstances, even if we were to optimize industrial and human performance across all the countries, which by the way is impossible from a practical perspective. And in which case you say, what is the Canadian contribution to that action? If it's 1% on the Paris Treaty understanding, does that mean that our entire national projects are subsumed to 1% action for an improbable, almost impossible outcome and therefore impossible cause? Are we playing a strategic nonsense? No other serious country plays in such a nonsense. They may, again, sloganeer about climate action and responsible action under climate change, but they don't mean to subsume their entire national project to such an absurd supposition. China doesn't behave in its national project in a way that suggests that all Chinese action is subservient to ensuring that we reverse climate circumstances of the entire world. Neither does the United States, neither does Russia, neither does Iran, neither does Japan. Only Canada, we've over the last, I would say, 10 or 15 years, very, I would say, foolishly convinced ourselves of some sort of nonsense whereby climate action is the center of public policy. And it's even more foolish if we look at this, again, this 4.15 combination game. What are our borders? Our borders are ACRE. The R border, which is the Arctic border, is not only a huge border internationally, but is proximate to 40% of our territory. That territory is the size of the European Union, that is the three territories of the North, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, with a population of slightly over 120,000 people, the size of Ajax, Ontario, as it were, maybe the size larger, slightly larger than the size of Trois-Rivières, Quebec. And our goal is somehow to reverse climate change so that either life becomes better for them or we refreeze that area, whereas all other countries realize that that area is opening up through climate change, and therefore they must do something. In which case, it's not climate action, it is action with respect to the Arctic border. So let's not be led by slogans, let's be led by reality on the ground. What are we going to do about that Arctic border? We're not going to change consumption patterns in Toronto in order to reckon with that Arctic border, which is opening up to the rest of the world. We couldn't have lost the country on such a stupidity. We're going to actually try to master that Arctic border and then maximize the strategic rents from that action. So let's call it, maybe from a slogan perspective, Arctic action or Northern action or whatever you like. That is climate action, between quotation marks, in any non-nonsensical form.
No, that's beautifully said. I do have a follow-up question, but I will weave that into the next one. And that's largely on looking at pragmatism, from a pragmatic policy making perspective, what would you like to see, in terms of climate policy making? But I know we don't have a lot of time, so I will weave it into the next question. And if you so choose, you can maybe highlight it. And that next question is on your talk about the need for a first ever 20-year Canada plan, one which is largely insulated from political forces. I read that piece and I was taking some time to, um, to consider the proposition. It does sound like a noble idea, having a long-term 20-year plan that really is divorced from political dynamics. But at the same time, given the intricate complexities of contemporary Canadian politics, particularly the sensitive and contentious issue of our federal-provincial relations, have you given further thought to likely constraints and bottlenecks, when it comes to pragmatism and operationalizing this? How might that turn out, assuming that decision makers even consider it in the first instance?
Well, thanks for raising it. I should say that the book has 10 theses, and all of the theses need to be taken as a totality, as a whole. And our Canadian approach would be to say, well, I like thesis 1 and 4, but I disagree with thesis 4 or 6. And I say it's taken as a whole, almost like a set of mathematical equations. One flows from the other. So there needs to be a long-term plan. It could be 20 years, it could be 50 years, but it cannot be 1 year. And that's to master some of the pressures, circumstances, and opportunities that I posit in the book. Now, you ask a great question about the constraints and practicalities or impracticalities of that plan. Let me start by saying that 20 years is a random number. It's an even number, but it is really long term. But it could be 30 or 40 years. It could be 15 or 18 years. The longer, the better. All the more to stretch the Canadian imagination beyond the tweet. We really have, during the pandemic in particular, reduced Canadian thinking to the next tweet. And we're trying to govern the second largest country in the world tweet by tweet, and to project some sort of mastery of our circumstances through elegant sentence construction on electronic platforms controlled out of San Francisco. This is the absurdity of our circumstances, and we believe in that. So we would say climate change, and I put climate change action in caps. That means I'm a better governor of the second largest country in the world than the last person who tweeted. We live in some sort of strategic absurdity. So the 20-year plan is really to stretch the imagination, to mobilize all the instruments of Canadian power and administration, and to project forward across the second largest country in the world. Now, it is not an apolitical plan. I never say it should be divorced from politics. Actually, it must be informed by politics, because what is the utility or import of politics in the plan? It is, first of all, to give imprimatur, democratic imprimatur, to different phases of the plan. There will be different phases, different spurts and starts. And also, importantly, to correct the plan at the margins, to bring to the content of the plan corrections from the ground. It cannot be a team of bureaucrats in Ottawa, however clever they may be, or however pure their intentions, unfurling an Ottawa imagination onto the second largest country in the world. It will only redound to nonsense. It must be a plan constructed across the country, led by the federal government, led by the government of the day, that is iterated through democratic inputs over the course of 20 years. But it provides our essential logic, what are we doing in this country over the next 20 years? Our very dogmatic Twitter-based response today is to say, well, first of all, Canada doesn't do plans. Democracies don't do plans. Apparently, only bad countries, non-democracies, do plans because democracies, we're so good, we don't need to plan, right? This is the nonsense. So only Soviet-like states plan. 5-year plans sound Soviet. I said, no, it's not a 5-year plan. It's a 5 times 4-year plan. So it's a 20-year plan, right? So we're a democracy that plans. That's an art of the 21st century. It's very difficult. The United States doesn't have 20-year plans, but they do have national strategic documents that project out. Australia is probably the only modern federal democracy that has any structure approaching national plans, and they do it through a very Commonwealth state type of structure, federal, provincial. And we need the same. We need so the federal government projects, it provides the essential logic, the provinces feed in. We do respect division of powers, but the division of powers in Canada are not watertight compartments or dogmatic or as tight as we imagine. They strategically overlap all the time. We need to be very conscious of the instruments at play. And we project 20 years out. And we need that as a country in order to survive our circumstances, to do anything. Otherwise, again, as a vassalized country, surrounded by these wicked borders, 15 combinations, we're going to be bandied about by these great powers at our borders without even realizing our circumstances.
Okay, very well said. And I know we are almost out of time now, so I'll share a few of the questions and ask my second to the last question. Of course, we've all heard about the whole 25% tariffs, proposition by the incoming president in the US, as well as the annexation issues, But recently too, because I do a lot, of course, in the global trade arena, and I know some business leaders and some policy experts, have been talking about propositions around an economic union, between both countries, similar to what you have in Europe, at the EU, the European Union. And there's been some talks about Canada and the US, forming an economic union with free borders, same currency, and all of that, Again, no official position, from Canada or the US, but as always, you know how sometimes these rumors can, end up getting traction. If that were to be the case, what pros and cons can you think about, of an economic union where the borders disappear, unify the currency, and, sort of tighten regulations, tax regimes, and other barriers to trade and other arrangements? What do you foresee under such a paradigm?
Well, it's a good abstraction, but if one understands the structure of Canada intimately, it would spell the end of Canada. That is, Canada would not survive the move to any union or merger. Canada would fall apart internally. There would be an immediate national unity crisis triggered. Quebec would either unilaterally declare independence or trigger a referendum that would be successful this time. By the way, if they were to trigger a referendum in the offing, it would be very dangerous again for the country because we, post-pandemic, have very difficult national unity pressures, and there's no very weakly legitimate centralized government in Canada, in my submission, post-pandemic today. So first of all, Canada would not survive a push to merger a union. In the abstract, it looks attractive, but it would be entirely asymmetrical and run from Washington. So Canada would just become an economic and resource space. But obviously, Canada at core, in its constitutional genesis, is not an economic or even resource union. It is a political union between French and English Canada to self-govern against the American project. The entire genesis of Canada is the counter thesis to the American project. Whatever we tell ourselves, that is the original purpose of Canada. They revolted against the crown. We stayed loyal. How do we govern this loyal territory politically across the French-English divide in the late 19th century? century, that is the construction of Canada. That informs the general compact that remains today. And if we break that compact, there may be some other form of union, but it wouldn't be Canada-US. It would be US and some form of Canadian geography, the nomenclature of which needs to be determined, but Quebec would immediately revolt. Let me also say that the European Union is an extremely successful project, but at the core, it was not an economic project. The project that you're describing and that some American analysts are proposing or imagining is an economic project. The European Union is a successful economic project today, but at core, it's a strategic project. It was a peace project to ensure that there would no longer be a world war with Germany at its center. So essentially, it's a project, European Union, to pacify Germany so that they don't misbehave along their own difficult wicket borders. Because the German strategic polemic was always France on one side and Russia on the other. And Germany must prepare for a two-front war. And the European Union removed one border from Germany. And today we imagine it to be a successful economic and human transportation, human movement project. But originally it's to pacify Germany. And in that sense, it's been extremely successful. But you see that it's not been totally perfect because the Russia war, Russia-Ukraine, stems from the limits of the European Union. That is, to Germany's east is a land that's not been integrated into the peace project of the European Union, and that's this giant state called Russia. And there lies one of the major strategic peace projects of the 21st century, what to do with Russia vis-a-vis Europe in particular, how to pacify it. In my submission, Canada can play an important role there. There you talk about creative deal making through the North. That is, through the North, through this climate action that we imagine in Ottawa, we can master the northern border, but unite all of these tectonic continental geopolitical plates that unify or that collide at the North. That is, East Asia, China in particular, the former Soviet space, Russia in particular, the European Union space, and the North American space, United States in particular, across the North through a massive pact, a trade compact. I even forget what I call it in the book, but Canada is at the center of that construction. And that devassalizes us, that allows us to get out of our post-pandemic doldrums. It energizes the population, it gives the young people a reason for dreaming, and it really saves the world in the early 21st century. That is, we have peaceful intercourse through the north of Canada, which combines markets that are twice as large, at least, as the current American market alone.
Brilliant, brilliant. That's a lot to unpack, but very brilliant and strategic. I mean, there's a lot to think about there. Yeah, as we bring this to a close, let me ask a question that's a little personal. I will do ask every guest on this show, in your own case, as a global policy leader, and thinker, who has done quite a lot, in Canada and overseas. You must have had your fair share, of ups and downs, setbacks, triumphs, and all of that. Are there any experiences or anecdotes, that you like to share as a major setback, helped you bounce back in any way? Have there been any experiences or projects or initiatives, that sort of didn't go the way you planned, but somehow through resilience and what have you, helped you to, strengthen your leadership capabilities and the global leader that you have become today?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd love to say I can't think of any mistakes in my career. It's all been smooth sailing and perfect. But let me share that the pandemic period, although lived differently in different parts of the world, was particularly catastrophic for Canada and for me as a Canadian citizen, as a policy leader and entrepreneur, and but also as a father, as a family man, was stunning in its real life devastation of our country. in its destabilization of people, its destabilization of young people in particular. And this shocked me again as a father, as a proud Canadian, as a policy person. And it was the physical shock of our performance in respect of this catastrophe that has made me extremely sensitive to the value of having a well-functioning country, and also alive to the counterfactual, which is not that abstract a counterfactual, what it means to lose a country, what it means for a great country, a big complex country like Canada, to fall apart. First of all, recognizing now that it could fall apart extremely fast, that entropy oblige, it would not be reconstituted in any recognizable form, if at all, and that the current form of Canada and any improved form, God willing, is worth fighting for. And therefore, I'm very hostile to glibness online, either in favor of Canada falling apart or dismissing Canada as some sort of colonial project or something that has had its day, or that the Americans have it right, so that we should merge. These are all abstractions that redound to potential misery on the ground that is very difficult to not only reckon with but reverse. And the pandemic made me very sensitive to that. So when I look at countries around the world that have collapsed in my lifetime and in my readings, or that could collapse, I'm extremely now alive to the possibility that could be us. It could be us tomorrow, it could be us after tomorrow, regardless of what we tell ourselves in Ottawa and other polite circles in the country. So that's in terms of the evolution of my own psychology as a thinker, as a practitioner. It's the psychology of realness. When I started my career in the Privy Council office, I was in my mid-20s. I was really close to the center of power. It was a great honor and privilege, but I had no felt sense of the consequences of failure. I was, first of all, very young. I had no family, and I didn't live in a country that could collapse. So I could say whatever I wanted, and I did, right? That's, you might cough that up to the glibness of youth, but I also think it's a function of the fact that I didn't know what misery was like in a felt sense, in a public sense. We did not have any felt sense of public catastrophes. Now in my mid 40s, I have that felt sense. It brings much more seriousness to my work, to my thinking, and more urgency to the task of helping our great country in what is a very interesting world, but a very wicked world indeed.
Excellent. I mean, food for thought. And for current and aspiring leaders in international public policy who would watch this at some point, one piece of advice for them.
Canada is one of the great countries of the 21st century.
Well, that concludes this edition of the Global Recast. Irvin, thank you so much for your time. This has been an enjoyable session and a lot of insights. I'm sure our listeners and partners will find this useful and insightful. On behalf of the team here, I would like to say thank you for making our time. And we do hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
You as well. Happy New Year to you and continued success in 2025.